Today is February 12th, 2014. The interview location is on Ridge Trail, Buxton, North Carolina. My name is Sandy Jones Garrison, and I am interviewing Elizabeth Browning Fox, who currently resides in Buxton, North Carolina. Liz is a direct descendant of the Burrus family, and several years ago she moved to Hatteras Island, making Buxton her permanent home. She quickly assimilated into her community, first co-owning with her brother Lou Browning the Hatteras Doves business. She is a member of the first group trained with CERT, a community emergency response team, and is a ham radio operator. Liz was instrumental with helping to set up the newly formed Ocean Center, a nonprofit located in Hatteras Village. During the cold months, she is out searching for cold-stunned sea turtles when the water temperature drops. Because of her interest in her family history and the importance of maintaining documentation, she is a strong supporter and participant of Coastal Voices. Liz has a vast amount of knowledge of her family tree, and hopefully she will discuss her lineage. Liz, please state your full name and where you were born.
Well, I was Elizabeth Burrus Browning, born in Winston-Salem. My mother is from Hatteras Village, and my father was from Winston-Salem at the time, originally from Birmingham, Alabama. And they met when my mother was in nursing school on a blind date, and they fell in love, got married, and never looked back.
And where did you live before moving to Buxton?
I lived outside of Winston-Salem until college, and then I lived in Chapel Hill, and after that I lived in the surrounding vicinity in Orange County and Chatham County, and stayed in that area for a long time, raised my family there, and when my kids grew up, I moved down to be closer to my folks, who were then living in Buxton.
In what year did you come back to live as a permanent resident?
2009.
So Liz, tell me about your parents. Do you want to start with your parents first and go back to the earlier ancestors, or do you want to start from the very beginning of the very original Burrus?
We're going to start early and
Okay.
move forward as long as we have time.
Okay.
There are a few family stories from the 1800s that have come down, but the earliest part are their research, family stories, tell this, tell that. None of it's absolute, none of it is completely documented. There was a Burrus and his daughter on the second boatload to Jamestown in 1607, I think was when it was established. Now, we don't have that line for sure. However, the next time the Burruses show up are in Bath or outside of Bath. There was John Burrus with two S's, who John Lawson knew when he was, John Lawson, the historian who wrote, the New History of the Carolinas. He was the artist and historian who gave us the most knowledge about the southeastern Indians. And a lot, if you see old pictures of Virginia and Carolina Indians, they were probably John Lawson's. So he was let's see, I think Bath was maybe it was established around 1696, and at that point John Burrus had a couple of hundred acres outside that area. At some point we don't have there again a family Bible telling us, but the next time that we see a documented Burrus is 1715, paying taxes in Cape Hatteras Banks, I think it was called. The names down here were changing. They were Chickamaucomico and Cape Hatteras Banks and they're Currituck. The county changed names 3 times, so you have to kind of look at the time you're talking about. But we think the jump from around 1700 to 715, we think that was John was the father and Robert was the son, because Robert had 2 sons and one of them was named John, and the old family naming tradition had names flip-flopping. The first and the middle name change place with the next generation. So you have a grandchild being named after a grandfather, but the family names carried down. Now, why would we have a Burrus out here in 1715 paying taxes? That doesn't mean that he hadn't arrived before then, but that was when he was paying taxes. The Tuscarora Indian Wars on the mainland started, I think, around 1711. And that was, John Lawson was one of the first people killed by the Tuscaroras. The English settlers, and who were also, I think, Swiss settlers, French settlers, there were a lot of settlers from different places in southeastern North Carolina from Europe. The Europeans did not treat the Indians very well, and the Indian Wars started, and they were brutal. They killed a whole lot of the white immigrants, settlers. At that time, John Lawson had moved down to establish Newbern, North Carolina, which was, what was it? I think it was a Swiss settlement. At any rate, he died in 1711. The wars got started, and a lot of people who were settlers, surviving settlers on the mainland, moved east because the natives of Hatteras Island were about the only people who didn't want to kill the immigrants. In fact, when John Lawson came out to Hatteras, he found Indians who said their grandparents could talk from a book, and some of them had gray eyes and auburn hair. And we know from history this. I don't know this from family tales. So we think that that's the way the Burruses came in, through Jamestown, then Bath, and then out to Hatteras. Now go forward a few generations, and we do have the lineage on Hatteras down pretty well from once they get here. We know who they are, and there are a few disagreements, but there were a whole lot of family Bibles. So there was, you go forward to the latter 1800s, and you jump over to the Williams family. Now, all of the old families, the same names are still down here, with the exception of just a few. Few names have been lost, and that's probably because they must have had a slew of girls, and the family names went to the husbands. But jump over to the Williams family. They were originally from Kennequite, and Bateman Williams came down here to Buxton to be an assistant lighthouse keeper at Cape Hatteras Lighthouse in 1860. His wife was Axa Maria. It's spelled Maria, but it's pronounced Mariah Scarborough. And they had 8 children. I think there were 4 girls and 4 boys. And anyway, Bateman was assistant lighthouse keeper. There were 2, both of them were Williams, who were the assistants. And 1860 was an interesting time because we were right at the very beginning of the unrest that became the Civil War. And when the head lighthouse keeper heard got the order from the Confederacy to remove the light from the lighthouse, Bateman was there. He and the other Williams took care of a beacon that was out on Cape Point. There was a secondary lighthouse out there, and they just called it the Beacon. And that was his primary job, was taking care of the beacon. But the lighthouse keeper, the main lighthouse keeper, had to leave the island because he had removed a navigational aid, and that was probably I don't know what they'd call it, treason, or it was very much against the law. So he had to leave. Bateman Williams, however, had 8 children and a wife, and I think the assistant keeper quarters had been built then. So he had a place to live. He stayed here and was lighthouse keeper during the entire Civil War. He was never made a main keeper, and I can only guess that was because he had been a Confederate. He did sign to say that he was not going to fight the Union, but they brought in a good Union lighthouse keeper to be the head light keeper there. It must have been incredibly stressful. He died in 1866. He was only 45 years old. His wife, this will make sense shortly. His wife, Axa Maria Scarborough Williams, was young. She was in her, I think she was in her early 30s, even though she had had 8 children. She was still very young, and they didn't waste good women down here. Well, she remarried and outlived that second husband, and I'm not naming names, although I know them. Well, then she remarried again. She was the original cougar, I think, because she was 40, I think she was 45, and her third husband was 27, and he actually did outlive her. He was a fisherman. She didn't have children after her first husband died. She didn't have any more children. But she was so well loved that when she died and her third husband's family buried her, the second husband's family came that night and dug her up and stole her and buried them in their family plot. Well, I think she eventually got back in the right place. She's buried right across from the entrance to Our Lady of the Seas in Buxton. So anyway, that was a little dash to the right. Well, those 8 children, one of the youngest ones, was my great-grandmother, Axa Williams, who married my great-grandfather, Ethelbert Dozier Burrus. And so she was named for her mother. And they called it was Achshah, but they really called it Axie. And it wasn't an uncommon name down here. There's still Axies around. Haven't heard that name anywhere else, though. So, so she married a Burrus, and his family. He was one of, I think there were 7 children. He had 3. He was one of 3 brothers, and there were 4 sisters. And so you're talking 8 kids on one side and 7 kids on the other. So you can see why I have so many cousins down here. But his name, Ethelbert Dozier Burrus. His father was Edmund Dozier or Edmund Daly. We're not sure. His grave marker says Edmund D. Burrus. So we're not sure which, but I think it was Edmund Dixon Burrus, or Edmund Dozier Burrus, because he had a son. His oldest son was Edmund Dixon Burrus. That would have been my grandfather's uncle. And he had another son, Zorobabel Burrus. Zorobabel was he was in the late 70s, he was already captain of Durance Station, life-saving station. And his other brother, Edmund Dixon Burrus, was known as Captain Dick. Dick Burrus was the captain of a local ship, a freight schooner called the William P. Cox. And then Ethelbert Dozier, my great-granddaddy Dozier, was the youngest of the three boys in the family. And he was in 1876. He also became an assistant keeper at Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, just like his father-in-law was. He was a fisherman, and then in the late 1870s, after he finished being a lighthouse keeper, he was also a member of the crew of his brother's, the William P. Cox schooner. The crew of the schooner, there were 6 men, all from Hatteras. They were all related to each other, and the Cox went out in October 1880. I think it was bringing freight from Maryland down to Wilmington, but I can't remember that for sure. And they saw it outside the inlet. A storm blew up. It couldn't make it in. You know how much trouble people have now with the inlet getting in and out. The fishing boats sometimes, the Coast Guard boats also. It wasn't a dredged inlet at that time. It was a natural inlet. And they couldn't get the ship in. And so they went back offshore, and the ship was never seen again. And all 6 men who were on the crew died. Their bones, their bodies never found. But that day, fortunately, my great-granddaddy, who was part of the crew, he was the youngest, so he was probably the cook. For some reason, he wasn't on the ship that day, and if he had been, then I wouldn't have been here, and there are probably thousands of people who wouldn't by now, or hundreds anyway, who wouldn't be here. I can name probably at least 10 or 12 folks on Hatteras that I know who wouldn't be here if he. So that was sad. Anyway, he was a captain as he got older. He was a ship captain. Did the West Indies trade from Boston down to the West Indies and back. And when he got older and retired, he had a bug eye, and he did smaller area trade on the Intracoastal Waterway, the inland route on this little bug eye named the Hamlet. One of the, let's see, his wife, Axa Williams Burrus, died very young. I think they had 7 children. So Ethelbert Dozier was one of 7 children, and I believe that he also had 7 children. And when his wife died, when my grandfather, who was the youngest of the children, was only 2 or 3 years old. He was 6 or 7. I can't remember for sure, but my grandfather didn't remember her. She died when he was so young. Well, Granddaddy Dozier needed someone to take care of his family. He had all these children at home, and he was a ship's captain. He needed to be able to leave, so what he did was he sailed down to Wilmington and got a wife, found a spinster who wasn't actually that old, but she was older than most women were when they married. She was also a seamstress, and married her, and brought her back. And she lived a long life. She was still alive when I was born, but I think she was already in a home, and I don't remember her. Miss Maggie. But he died I think in 1936. So, that brings us some Burruses to present time. Okay. 2 lighthouse keepers, several ship's captains.
Well, just for clarification, Liz, you started out with the Burrus family, and then you moved on to the Williams family, and then you went back to the Burrus family. So can you tell me again
the connection
between those names?
Because Bateman and Axa Williams, daughter Axa or Axie, married my great-grandfather, Ethelbert Dozier Burrus. So I was giving you the background of 2 of my great-grandparents.
Okay.
And great-great-grandparents.
Well, I remember you talking about Miss Maggie before, and I think, was she the one that gave you one of your favorite pair of earrings?
Yes, I'm wearing them.
Okay. We'll be able to get that in a photograph. You want to have a story about those earrings? Because they're beautiful.
I don't know much about them. What Mama has said to me was when Miss Maggie died and they went through her things, they found some she was a seamstress in Wilmington with her mother, and they found some lovely, lovely, dainty, delicate, handmade things, and that she never, ever would have worn down here, and these earrings. But they couldn't they just couldn't see the Maggie that they knew living in Hatteras was not the Maggie who was represented as a lady coming from Wilmington. Life was way different out here. Now, I do remember a few stories about Miss Maggie. She was quite a character. So this would have been in the 30s. In my mother's memory, when she was a little girl, she told me that Miss Maggie, they didn't have a lot of cloth. Everything, the Hatteras was supplied completely by ship. And they were kind of the end of the line. So people didn't have riches out here to trade. They had salvage from shipwrecks. So they did have something. But they didn't really get a lot of bolts of cloth, and they were all very frugal. So Mama said she remembered that Miss Maggie's underwear that she'd wash and hang up always said Pillsbury's Finest across the seat, because they took the flour bags and turned them into underwear. And she washed them, and she made lye soap, and she washed them outside. She had a big old cauldron, pot, whatever, big old pot that she'd mix up the lye and the water and build a fire under it to get it hot, and then she'd put her clothes in and poke them down with a stick, and then they'd wring them and they'd hang them. They didn't really have a hanger. They just lay them over the fig bushes to dry. And Mama said she washed her hair in that same lye soap, which turned it just sparkling white. And she said it was beautiful until one summer. It was just a really hot, miserable summer, and I don't know whether there was another issue or not. But one summer she just got fed up with it, and she shaved her head and then wore a bonnet on it to keep from getting sunburn. So Mama and her brother, Uncle Steve, were little, and they were just amazed at that. She and great-granddaddy Dozier slept on she made a feather bed. I mean, and it was feather bed. It wasn't down, it was feathers. and saved all the chicken feathers and the goose feathers and such, and made this old feather bed, which they would sleep with. I don't know whether it was breath or what, but she would sleep with her head at one end, and he would sleep with his head at the other end. And every week they'd take it and haul it out to sun. She'd just kind of droop it out through the window and let the sun hit it to freshen it.
Well, you have an old bed in your house, or is that from a relative, or the mattress? Was that
Are you in where
the North house?
There was an old bed in it. My sons claimed it, but that was made for me by an old man from Spruce Pine.
Okay.
From the mountains when it was before I got married.
Okay.
He made that bed for me.
Well, I'm curious about, you have a lot of ship captains in your family. Do you have any knowledge or where their ships came from, or the money to buy them, or do you have any history on how that came about?
I know some people built ships down here, and other people just captained them. And of course, one of the main, and we're talking about traders, big ships. I don't know where they would have found the funding to buy a ship, to own a ship. So I'm guessing they were just, captains and crew from other ships. But I don't know. There were a lot of folks down here were pilots listed. If you look at the old censuses, they're listed as pilot. Fisherman, pilot, but lots of pilots. And that was because all the big trading boats up and down the East Coast, if they wanted to come into North Carolina ports, there was no Oregon Inlet and there was no Hatteras Inlet, but there was Ocracoke Inlet, and that was for many, many years. That was the main way that people could get in from outside and go into the sounds and go to all the cities, the coastal cities in North Carolina, the inland coastal cities. So there were many ships passing through Ocracoke Harbor. So that was what really established Ocracoke. Was a lot of people came down from Hatteras, and a lot of people came up from Portsmouth. I mean, because some of them were in Portsmouth too, because it was an inlet between Portsmouth and Ocracoke, and a lot of them lived down there and took their families down there, and just their big thing was to pilot those ships in through the inlet, because it was dangerous. You had to know where the shoals were. You had to know exactly what you were doing, or you'd go aground, or worse. When Hatteras Inlet was cut in the 1840s, I can't remember what date exactly, but there was a really horrible hurricane in the 1840s, and I think it cut both Oregon Inlet and Hatteras Inlet. But Hatteras Inlet was so much better for navigating than Ocracoke Inlet was. That's kind of why Ocracoke Village settled down and Portsmouth kind of started a slow death. And Hatteras was the boomtown then, because that's where the pilots lived. My ancestors, I'm not just a Burrus, I'm a Burrus, Balance, Gaskins, Gaskell, Howard, Williams, Scarborough, Wahab. And if you know the names down here, some of those are Ocracoke names and Portsmouth names, and I have ancestors from, I think the Gaskells were from Portsmouth, and the Gaskins and Wahabs and were mainly from Ocracoke, and then you move up and you have Burruses Burruses were in Ocracoke too.
Any grays?
In my background, I am related. I have many, many, many gray cousins, but let's see. I have many gray cousins. So many I can't even count them. But I don't have any in my direct background. My grandfather's oldest sister, Elada, married. Let's see. She married. Was it Robert Gaskins? She married, I think it was a she married a Gaskins, without my family tree in front of me, I can't remember. She married a Gaskins who, then her daughter, Rosa Gaskins, married Dameron, the eldest Dameron Gray, who there are about 4 generations of Dameron Grays, and DM and Dameron, but married her daughter, I guess my granddad's first cousin married a Gray, and so those are a lot of the folks you know around here, you know, you know Melody Schwartz, you know Ronna Connor at Connors, and Ray Gray, and these are all those grandchildren were Dameron Ray and Ray Senior and Hal Gray. So there are I have tons of Gray cousins, and
well, I want to ask you about Portsmouth Island. So did you have any family relatives that ever lived on Portsmouth Island, or they all stayed really Hatteras?
I have ancestors from Portsmouth, but in recent times I haven't found anybody who lived there when Portsmouth became park and all the people were moved. I haven't really looked there, but I do know I have family from Portsmouth. And I saw that one of my great, I don't know how many great-grandmothers died at Lake Mattamuskeet. Now, I wish I knew the story. You know, what did she do? Did she drown? Or, you know, or get yellow fever? Or, you know, so I see all of these interesting, you know, these folks move, and because they're, you know, this was a seaport area, there were people going to sea, so they were not mobile the way you think about people being mobile on land. They were mobile in a whole different manner.
Well, I'm going to test your mind here now, because I'm trying to get my notes straight. So, start the present. We're going to work back, and let's see if you can name your direct descendants as far as you can go back, starting with yourself.
My ancestors? No.
Starting with your mom.
I can't keep the names straight. I can give you a few of them, but I really have to remind myself.
Okay.
Mama's dad was...
Well, what's your mom's full name?
My mother, Dixie Burrus Browning.
Okay.
Her dad was Morris Lennon Burrus, and his nickname was Dick. And her mother was Rebecca Stevens Burrus, or Rebecca Mary Stevens, who married Dick Burrus. And I think they married around in 1929. And at that time he was a professional baseball player, which it's so bizarre thinking about a professional baseball player found on Hatteras in those days. But he went off to school, and he actually he was, I think, something like a 4-letter man at NC State. So
we're talking about Morris Dick Burrus.
Dick Burrus, yeah.
Okay.
And I know he played baseball. He was on the varsity baseball, football, track, and tennis teams. So he was quite the athlete. And then he had a nice career. He played well. He played for the Boston Braves and the Philadelphia Athletics and the Indiana Indians, and I can't remember the different teams because they traded him around like they do today. But his main career, where he, I think, got most of his fame, was as a left-handed first baseman for the Boston Braves. So his career, I think he had a what do you call it, a hernia. I think he had a hernia that didn't heal, so that was the end of his baseball career. He had invested heavily in the stock market, and that was around 1929, 1930. So he lost a lot during the Depression, but down here, people probably never even realized there was a depression because it was always a depression down here. It was tough. So he and his young wife, who was then pregnant, moved in with his parents, were with his dad, Captain Dozier, and his stepmom, Miss Maggie.
Okay.
And her name was Maggie Douglas from Wilmington. And then as they moved in with them, and then as his parents got older, they lived with him once he was more established. So they were very much together. But he was the youngest son, and that was what they did.
And can you recall, I know I'm testing your brain here, Captain Dozier Burrus's father?
His father was Edmund.
That's right.
That was Edmund either Dozier or Dixon Burrus. And his wife was Sarah Gaskins. And I believe she was from Ocracoke.
Okay.
And her mother was a Gaskell, and I think she was from Portsmouth, and father was from Ocracoke.
Well, that's pretty good, Liz. That's like 5 generations there. So can you remember who Edmund Dozier's father was? Or Edmund Dixon?
Whoever, whichever he was, the mystery. I think his father was maybe the first Zachariah. The timing would be about right, because he had a grandson, Zachariah. There are 2 Zacharias. One of the Zacharias was in the War of 1812. And I think the timing would be about right. So Edmund Dixon was, I think his father Zachariah was in the War of 1812. Now there was a grandson Zachariah, and that family, that offshoot from Zorobabel, those are the great grandparents of other Burruses down here, like Allen, and Allen in Hatteras, Burrus Red and White.
And you have Dwight Burrus, who must be another lineage.
Dwight's my second cousin. Dwight's grandfather and my grandfather were brothers. Okay. And we were going for Allen's branch of the Burruses. We go back another generation to have parents who are siblings. But the older Zachariah was in the War of 1812. He is my direct line. Okay. But there's a younger Zachariah who was fought for the Union Army. He was, when Hatteras was, that was I think Allen's group, Allen's line. He was the Union took over Hatteras at the very beginning of the Civil War. They occupied, and here they came to this very poor place. These people didn't have big plantations. There were a few slaves, but it was never a huge thing down here. It wasn't a way of life. And so when the union came, they found some young men. They asked if they'd like to join. Hey, you join, you get paid, you get clothes, you get blankets, you get fed, and it sounded pretty good. So they were, I can't remember the volunteer group, but they were the North Carolina Union Volunteers. So that wasn't my direct line. That was the, going back to cousins.
Do you have any information on, through the generations, how those families communicated off island? I mean, letters. I mean, how did they communicate to their families who didn't live in Hatteras?
Well, there was
Island?
mail.
Mm-hmm.
There was mail, and I would assume they. Have you heard the term down here, calling off the mail? Have you ever heard
I have
anybody
not
use
heard
that?
that.
Okay.
Calling off
the
the
mail. When Mama was growing up, they'd go to the post office. You don't say, has the mail truck come yet? You say, have they called off the mail yet?
Mm-hmm.
Now that goes back to before Mama was born, but you still hear a few people saying, have they called off the mail? What it was the mail boat would come in, and most of the places on the island where we have post offices or a building that was a post office, they're on the sound side, and there's a way to get in. If you look at the Buxton post office, the gift shop that used to be the old post office gift shop in Frisco, that was, I mean, boats would come in, freight boats would come in, or mail boats, and they'd come in and they'd get this big thing of mail out, and I guess the postmaster or postmistress would go through it, and they'd call the names out, and people would come down when they'd be waiting for news from somewhere else, so they'd say, has the mail been called off?
Well, you mentioned marriages of your direct ancestors. Did they actually get married on the island? Did they have a minister that married them, or did they have to go off the island to get married, or how was that done?
I think there was always religion down here, and if you had religion, you had someone who was a preacher who could marry you. Mm-hmm. There have been settlements, some of the more sparsely populated settlements out here might have had a circuit preacher who came by, every so many second or third week, who would go, and that kind of continues today. If you think about it, you have 3 villages that don't really have enough support for a minister for each of the churches, so you have the same preacher for the Buxton Methodist Church, the Hatteras Methodist Church, and the Frisco Methodist Church, which is Little Grove. But you have the same preacher for 3 different churches. I suppose that when it was harder to travel, people may have taken a little more time between services, like 1 week to the next.
And you don't have Bible documentation, or do you?
We do have a lot of Bible documentation. I do not have any of the family Bibles, and I have not. I know that Alan has one of the older family Bibles, I've heard, but I don't know who has the family Bibles.
Yeah. I mean, were your family mainly Methodist or Baptist, or did any religious affiliation?
Probably all of the above.
Okay. All right. What do you know about haulover? And because you said that you have family ancestors that were involved, they were ship captains, and were there any stories about them using that part of the island to go from the Sound to the ocean, the Haulover area, or?
Probably the Kinnikiters would have those stories.
Okay, all right.
But if you're, my family base was more Hatteras Village.
All
So,
right.
so they would have had the inlet.
Any stories that trickle down, either just oral tradition stories, interaction with Native Americans?
Not in my family, although the research groups, the Lost Colony Research Group and the Hatteras Family Names groups do have some.
Mm-hmm.
And there are several names down here that were associated. In 1800 or 1801, it was made illegal in the United States for any white people to marry people of color. Now, there were some known Indian families down here. There was Indian Town. There were several Indian settlements.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, there was more and more assimilation. But you suddenly had a situation where, in 1801, and this was about the time that the first Hatteras lighthouse was built too, about that same time, there was obviously more scrutiny down here than there had been. And it was, suddenly families weren't legal because there were some that were, we can tell by some of the old photos that folks were obviously, you could see more of the Native American lineage.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm told is kind of a highlight on that is that some families that were obviously married with children kept the woman's name after about 1801. They kept, which suggests that maybe the man was part Indian or full Indian. And some families, the names changed in an odd way, and the wills were left to people who didn't seem to be related.
Okay.
So I think the law affected people a little less out here, but obviously there was some scrutiny.
Okay.
So it became very difficult to track. My mother did DNA testing that shows that this was a family DNA testing that shows that can go back about 6 generations. Mama's background shows that she has 2 or 3% non-European background, which would be about right. We have heard through family stories that my grandfather, Dick Burrus's mother and grandmother were where the Indian came in our family. And that's just the old family story. Apparently, they knew it. They looked it. And that's just come down through the generations. But that 3% non-European is quite possibly that.
So the first captain that you mentioned was Captain Dozier Burrus. Would any written documentation about any rescues or shipwrecks or anything that's been passed down, just oral tradition? Any memories about that? Or
probably are. Other than the Cox is the schooner Cox is the main family story of the shipwreck.
okay.
And loss of family members. It was so significant that my great-grandfather, when the Cox went down, he lost his brother, but his sister Jane lost her brother, but she also lost her husband. He was part of the crew.
Okay.
And she also lost her brother-in-law. So, I mean, she lost 3 significant men in her life. I mean, they were all family. These 6 men, if you can imagine in a little village losing 6 men overnight.
And Captain Dozier happened to miss that trip.
Right. He missed that trip, fortunately for all of us.
And remind me again what caused that
A
ship to go
nor'easter
down? It's
blew
a nor'easter?
up. It was in the fall of 1880, and a nor'easter blew up, and it never came back. The ship was just gone. Now, on that part of the family, one of the more interesting people was his sister, who, let's see, she was Chrissy Jane, I think Chrissy Jane Burrus, she was Jane Burrus who married, or was she Christiana? I think she was Christiana Jane, but she was known as Jane. She and her husband, who was part of the crew and died, had 2 little boys. I mean, they were just toddlers. They were young. And or was it? Hold on. Yeah, it was his sister's. So it was his sister. I'm trying to think about how to say it clearly. Captain Dick's brother-in-law, who was part of the crew, died, leaving his sister a widow with 2 small boys. One of those boys was Joe Merritt Burrus, who she remarried. He grew up. He became the longest careered lighthouse keeper at the Ocracoke Lighthouse. I think he was the last one. He wasn't the very last lighthouse keeper there, but he was the very last one to live there. And my mother remembers going there and staying with his wife Eleanor at the house, the keeper's house right next to the lighthouse when she was young. But he was there for, that wasn't the only place. That wasn't the only place that Joe Merritt Burrus was lighthouse keeper, but that was the longest time. There was another time that he was I can't remember the year, but it was in maybe 1919, I think. There was a huge cold winter that froze entire Pamlico Sound. All the sounds in North Carolina froze, and it was hard. I mean, it was like Maine weather come south. Anyway, he was on a little lighthouse out in the Sound. It's out from I think they got there from Ocracoke. He was on this light, and he'd go out for couple weeks at a time, and then he'd come in, and they'd rotate. I can't remember whether it was 2 weeks on and 1 week off, or something like that. But you had a house. These little Sound lighthouses. Have you ever seen one?
Mm-mm.
They're like a little house. They have a porch all around. They have a lighthouse. They're not really tall because they're just navigational aids in the Sound to help people get around. But they go out there and they take all their supplies, and they'd have maybe 1 or 2 bedrooms and a kitchen and a living room. They were very small, but they stayed out there alone usually, and they could fish. They could smoke their pipes, and they could read, and they could do whatever. But their families lived on I think so. Joe Merritt Burrus's his wife Eleanor lived on Ocracoke, and every now and then for a special occasion, and I know all this because my cousin Jack Willis got this kind of collected this together for me, so I read it fairly recently. But thinking about this cold winter, but anyway, for Christmas, Eleanor would get I think there were 6 kids, get all of them, pile them in a boat, and they'd go out there. And one year they took the tree, they took the dog, they took all the kids and the presents and the meal already, and they had Christmas out there. And they they couldn't even spend the night, but they go out and keep them company, and then they go in. It was great duty. But this year, 1919 or 1920, the winter of 1919, 1920, it was so cold that they couldn't get out to him. He was out there for 30 days surrounded by ice, if you can imagine. He ran out of almost everything, but the thing that bothered him the most, he was a true nicotine addict, and he ran out of his chewing tobacco. and it got down to the point that I think he was chewing on, like tar caulk. Anyway, but they couldn't get out to rescue him, and he couldn't get in. It was terrible times. He wasn't sure if he was going to starve to death first or not. But that was it makes this winter look mild.
Well, Liz, is there anything final comments you want to say before you conclude your interview, or no?
No, there's always new leaves to turn over, and new family members. I've enjoyed connecting with some of the family members that I didn't know, and hearing stories that I hadn't heard before. But our family does, because the families down here, it's different than most places. A lot of people have, if they have ancestors from here, they still have some connection. They tend to know who their cousins are out still living here, and a lot of them have stayed. I mean, I just have tons and tons of second cousins, third cousins, and more out here. So I think the stories tend to get told more when you have family that's together like this.
Well, I think you're a gift to the community. One, your background in folklore history, is that right? From North Carolina?
UNC, yeah.
UNC. And that you're back home, really. I mean, you're back to your roots.
Yeah.
Welcome home.
Thanks.